At the 25th anniversary gala of Hale Industries, beneath crystal chandeliers and in front of investors, executives, and cameras, Matthew Hale raised a glass, then lowered it to announce he was divorcing his wife. He called her the janitor I married out of charity. Laughter followed, applause from a few who thought it was bold. He handed Paige Porter the papers on stage as if serving a memo. She accepted them without a word. No one in that ballroom knew the company was not his to divide, and the woman he dismissed owned it all. If you believe dignity speaks louder than humiliation, stay with this story to the very end. Justice does not rush, but it never forgets. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and your local time. And if stories about quiet strength and rightful justice matter to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss what comes next. Every morning at 6:10 a.m., before the executive elevators began carrying tailored suits to the top floors of Hale Industries, Paige Porter entered through the service corridor on West 52nd Street. The security guard at the desk nodded without really looking at her. He had memorized her uniform, not her face. Navy slacks, pale gray shirt, company-issued badge clipped neatly at the collar. The badge read, Facilities Maintenance. To most people in the building, that was the extent of her identity. Paige preferred it that way. She moved quietly through marble hallways, still echoing from the night crew's vacuum lines. She carried no cart when she could avoid it. Efficiency mattered to her. Precision mattered more. She wiped surfaces others rarely noticed, edges of glass doors, brass railings, conference table undersides where fingerprints collected unnoticed by executives who discussed billion-dollar acquisitions. She observed everything. The third-floor executive wing was always her last stop. By then, the sun had climbed high enough to stain the Hudson River in pale gold. From those windows, Manhattan looked invincible. Matthew loved that view. Matthew Hale, Chief Executive Officer. To the financial press, he was a self-made visionary. Interviews described him as relentless, decisive, brilliant under pressure. Business magazines ran profiles detailing how he had transformed Hale Industries into a $50 billion powerhouse over the past decade. They rarely mentioned the foundation beneath him. Paige had read every article. 7 years earlier, when she married Matthew in a private ceremony in Connecticut, the headlines had been kinder. Back then, Hale Industries was successful, but not monumental. Matthew had ambition. Paige had silence. Their wedding had been small, 50 guests at an estate owned by one of Matthew's early investors. Reporters had speculated about Paige's background. No one could find much information. No social media trail. No public resume. She had been described simply as a private individual. That description was accurate. Inside the marriage, assumptions hardened quickly. Matthew believed in visible achievement. He believed success must be displayed to be validated. When Paige declined to join charity boards or attend every industry dinner, he interpreted her restraint as inadequacy. You don't have to pretend, he once told her during their second year of marriage. You don't need to understand the business. Just support me. Paige had nodded. Support she understood. What Matthew did not understand was a structure. Hale Industries had not begun as his idea. 32 years earlier, when Matthew's father struggled to keep a small manufacturing firm solvent. A quiet capital injection saved it. That capital had come from the Porter family. But that history was sealed inside contracts, trusts, and signatures inked long before Matthew's name appeared on any letterhead. Paige remembered sitting in her father's study at age 12 while he explained ownership, not as possession, but as responsibility. Power, her father had told her, is safest when it doesn't announce itself. The Porter family did not chase publicity. They built leverage through patience. By the time Hale Industries pivoted into technology logistics, the Porters held a controlling interest, 62%, through layered trusts designed to shield beneficiaries from liability and interference. Matthew knew the company had early investors. He believed they had gradually exited. He had been told the majority shares were held by an institutional entity managed through private trustees. That was true. What he did not know was who the beneficiary of that trust had become. 3 years before the gala, Paige's father passed away after a brief illness. There was no dramatic deathbed confession, no revelation scene. The documents had already been prepared. The irrevocable trust transferred fully to Paige as sole beneficiary, exactly as designed decades earlier. She inherited majority ownership the same week Matthew finalized a strategic merger that doubled the company's market valuation. He celebrated on CNBC. She signed transfer confirmations in a Boston law office under the guidance of Victoria Langford, her former classmate from Columbia Law. Paige had earned her law degree quietly before she met Matthew. She never practiced publicly. Matthew assumed she had abandoned that path out of disinterest. He had never asked. When Paige began working inside the company as facilities staff 6 months after her father's death, Matthew found it mildly embarrassing. "You don't need to work," he told her. "I prefer to," she replied. He interpreted it as restlessness. It was surveillance. From the service corridors, Paige learned more about Hale Industries than any board presentation could reveal. She saw which executives lingered after meetings. She overheard conversations not intended for formal minutes. She memorized rhythms, who deferred to whom, who hesitated, who feared Matthew's temper when quarterly targets slipped. She kept a small leather notebook in her locker. Dates, observations, quotes without commentary. Not evidence yet, just awareness. Within the marriage, distance widened in small increments. Matthew traveled more frequently. Investor retreats in Aspen, conferences in Singapore, strategy sessions that extended past midnight. When he was home at the penthouse overlooking Central Park, he carried tension like static electricity. "You wouldn't understand the pressure," he said once, loosening his tie in the kitchen. Paige studied him as she washed a single wineglass. "You're right," she answered softly. He mistook that for agreement. What Matthew valued most was perception. He cultivated loyalty through reward and fear through unpredictability. Promotions arrived suddenly. Departures were swift. In interviews, he spoke about meritocracy. In private, he dismissed vulnerability. "She's comfortable," he once told CFO Robert Klein during a late-night conversation in the executive lounge, unaware that the glass walls carried sound farther than he assumed. Paige doesn't want anything complicated. She likes simple work. Paige had been polishing the hallway brass when she heard it. She did not pause. The janitorial position granted her unrestricted access during off hours. She reviewed discarded drafts from conference rooms before shredders consumed them. She noted financial modeling assumptions scribbled on whiteboards and erased imperfectly. Matthew believed proximity equaled dominance. He believed that because Paige stood physically beneath the executive floors, she occupied a lower plane of influence. He did not see the architecture beneath him. At company holiday parties, executives' spouses treated Paige with polite confusion. Some thought she was staff assigned to assist the event. Others assumed she volunteered to stay busy. Only once did someone ask directly, "Why work here?" an investor's wife asked, glancing at Paige's uniform. Paige considered the question. "Because I care how it's run," she replied. The woman smiled indulgently, assuming it was sentiment. Matthew never publicly corrected those assumptions. On some level, he benefited from them. The narrative of a powerful CEO married to an unassuming, grateful wife reinforced his image. He did not recognize the asymmetry. The night before the anniversary gala, Matthew stood in front of their bedroom mirror, rehearsing portions of his speech. "Vision," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Leadership, discipline." Paige sat at the vanity behind him, brushing her hair slowly. He glanced at her reflection. "You don't have to come tomorrow if you'll feel uncomfortable." "I won't feel uncomfortable," she answered. That was the only untruth she allowed herself, because she already knew what the next evening would bring. 2 weeks earlier, a draft of the divorce filing had been delivered to a private investigator Matthew believed discreet. The investigator had once worked security at Hale Industries. He had been careful. but not careful enough. Information moves differently when the majority shareholder has reason to observe. Paige had received a copy before the gala invitations were mailed. She had not confronted Matthew. She had not cried. She had not asked why. Instead, she scheduled a meeting in Boston. Matthew assumed control because he signed the paychecks. He assumed ownership because his name appeared on the office door. He assumed superiority because Paige remained silent. In the early morning light of that anniversary day, as Paige finished wiping the glass wall outside the executive conference room, she studied her reflection faintly layered over the Manhattan skyline. From this angle, she appeared small against the city. But the structure beneath the glass belonged to her. And by the time Matthew raised a champagne glass that evening, believing he was severing himself from something insignificant, the outcome had already shifted. He just didn't know it yet. Long before Hale Industries occupied 42 floors of mirrored glass in Manhattan, it had been a struggling regional manufacturer operating out of a converted warehouse in Newark. Matthew Hale remembered the warehouse as a symbol of grit. In interviews, he described walking between oil-stained machines as a teenager watching his father fight to keep the company alive. What he did not remember, because he had never been told, was the meeting that saved it. 32 years earlier, in a quiet office overlooking Boston Harbor, Arthur Porter reviewed a thin folder labeled Hale Industrial Components. The numbers were unremarkable, revenue inconsistent, debt mounting. But the concept adaptive supply chain logistics, before the term existed, interested him. Arthur Porter did not invest emotionally. He invested structurally. He agreed to inject capital under strict conditions. Majority equity transferred to a family trust, voting rights retained, and long-term governance provisions embedded in the company's bylaws. The Hale family would continue operating publicly. The Porters would remain invisible. It was not charity. It was architecture. The trust established that year was irrevocable. Ownership would pass through bloodline, not publicity. Beneficiaries would not be listed in annual reports. The arrangement ensured two things: stability for the company and protection for the family's privacy. When Matthew's father signed the agreement, he signed away control to survive. Over time, survival turned into growth. Growth into expansion. Expansion into dominance. Matthew inherited executive authority after his father's retirement, but authority was not ownership. He assumed the largest shareholder was a distant financial institution uninterested in daily operations. Quarterly dividends were distributed through trustee channels. Board oversight remained minimal as long as performance metrics were met. Matthew performed well. Arthur Porter never interfered publicly. He attended annual meetings through proxy representation. When Paige was a child, she occasionally accompanied her father to a discreet conference room where trustees summarized company reports. She listened more than she spoke. "What do you see?" Arthur once asked her, sliding a financial statement across the table when she was 16. Paige studied the numbers. "They're scaling too quickly in one region," she said after several minutes. "If shipping costs fluctuate, margins collapse." Arthur did not smile easily, but that day he did. "You're looking at structure," he told her, "not headlines." Paige attended Columbia University years later, earning degrees in economics and law. She specialized in corporate governance and trust law, not because she intended to practice in courtrooms, but because she understood inheritance was more than wealth. It was responsibility layered across time. When she met Matthew at a policy conference in Washington, D.C., he did not know her last name carried weight in rooms he had never entered. She introduced herself simply as Paige. He was charismatic, driven, restless in a way that felt kinetic rather than reckless. He spoke about scaling globally, about modernizing infrastructure, about transforming his father's company into something formidable. Paige admired ambition when it was tethered to discipline. They dated quietly. Matthew appreciated her discretion. In her presence, he felt less scrutinized than he did around investors or board members. She did not compete for attention. She asked questions others overlooked. "What safeguards are in place if leadership changes abruptly?" she once asked him over dinner. He laughed. "I'm not going anywhere." That wasn't the question, she replied gently. He mistook her caution for insecurity. When they married, Arthur Porter attended but did not announce his stake in Hale Industries. He shook Matthew's hand firmly and offered no warnings. The trust documents already anticipated succession. 3 years before the anniversary gala the same year, Matthew orchestrated the largest merger in company history. Arthur Porter's health declined unexpectedly. It was not prolonged. It was not dramatic. A diagnosis, a brief hospitalization, then silence. In the weeks following the funeral, Paige met with trustees in Boston. Victoria Langford sat across from her in a conference room paneled in dark wood, legal documents arranged in meticulous stacks. As sole beneficiary, Victoria explained, "You now hold controlling interest through the Porter Trust, 62% of Hale Industries." Paige nodded once. "There are disclosure thresholds if you intervene directly," Victoria continued. "But as long as governance remains stable, anonymity is preserved." "Has Matthew ever been informed of the structure in detail?" Paige asked. "Only what the board deemed necessary at the time of his appointment," Victoria answered. "He knows a majority shareholder exists. He does not know who." Paige absorbed that quietly. Ownership did not thrill her. It steadied her. She returned to New York and attended Matthew's celebratory dinner after the merger closed. Champagne flowed. Analysts predicted exponential growth. Matthew toasted to vision realized. He did not notice the transfer confirmation Paige had signed that afternoon. The trust's language was precise: shares acquired prior to marriage remained separate property. Appreciation of those shares, as long as not commingled with marital assets, retained classification as separate. Paige ensured no commingling occurred. Dividends flowed into trust-managed accounts, untouched by joint expenditure. Their penthouse was purchased through Matthew's compensation package. Investments were kept distinct. She did not hide assets. She preserved boundaries. 6 months after her father's passing, Paige requested employment within Hale Industries, not at an executive level, but in facilities operations. The board's Human Resources Division processed the request without alarm. Majority shareholders were entitled to observe corporate operations. Few chose to do so from the ground floor. Matthew objected lightly. "You don't need to prove anything," he told her. "I'm not proving," she said. "I'm learning." From within the building's infrastructure, Paige mapped the company's culture. She noticed subtle shifts after the merger: aggression in expansion targets, tolerance for ethical gray areas. Executives who once questioned risk began deferring to Matthew's momentum. In one closed-door strategy session overheard through an ajar service corridor, CFO Robert Klein raised concerns about debt exposure. "We're leveraged heavily if interest rates spike," Robert warned. "We'll refinance," Matthew replied dismissively. "Scale first, stabilize later." Paige wrote the date in her notebook. Not because she doubted Matthew's intelligence, because she recognized imbalance. The Porter Trust's governing clause allowed intervention if executive conduct threatened long-term viability. It did not require public confrontation. It required evidence. Paige did not interfere prematurely. She observed quarterly earnings calls from the back of conference rooms while polishing glass partitions. She read internal memos discarded after revisions. She watched how junior analysts hesitated before delivering unfavorable forecasts. Matthew thrived on admiration. He interpreted caution as lack of confidence. "She doesn't even care about the company," he once told Robert in a private exchange referencing Paige. "She's content cleaning floors." Robert offered a neutral shrug. "Some people prefer simple lives." Paige heard that too. Simplicity, she knew, was often misinterpreted by those who equated noise with strength. As Hale Industries expanded internationally, the trust's valuation multiplied. $50 billion became the figure cited in financial media. Matthew's face appeared on magazine covers beneath headlines celebrating visionary leadership. Paige's name appeared nowhere. She preferred it that way, but invisibility does not equal absence. The Porter Trust maintained veto authority over structural changes, equity dilution beyond specified thresholds, sale of core assets, amendments to governance bylaws. Matthew rarely reviewed those clauses personally. He delegated legal compliance to external counsel. As long as performance soared, no one examined dormant authority, until pressure mounted. In the months leading to the anniversary gala, Matthew grew increasingly impatient with oversight limitations. He proposed a restructuring designed to attract additional institutional investors. The plan required issuing new shares. Minor dilution, he assured the board. We remained dominant. Thomas Reed, senior board member, raised a quiet concern. What about the majority shareholders' consent? Matthew waved it off. They've never interfered. That assumption rested on ignorance. Paige requested updated copies of all restructuring drafts through trustee channels. She reviewed them at night in the penthouse office Matthew rarely entered. Clause by clause, she identified implications. The dilution would not eliminate the trust's majority outright, but it would erode leverage gradually, enough to weaken veto authority over time. Matthew believed the anonymous shareholder passive. He did not consider vigilance. On the evening before the gala, while Matthew rehearsed his speech in their bedroom mirror, Paige finalized a separate set of documents in her own handwriting. Notes for Victoria. Requests for certified bank records dating back 15 years. Confirmation of trust provisions regarding marital dissolution. Because Paige had also received information Matthew did not know had leaked. A draft divorce filing. She understood its significance beyond personal betrayal. If Matthew succeeded in classifying the trust shares as marital property, an unlikely but disruptive legal argument, he could trigger forced disclosure. He underestimated her preparation. Power built over decades does not evaporate under spotlight. As midnight approached on the eve of public celebration, Paige stood alone by the penthouse window overlooking Central Park. The city pulsed with indifferent energy below. She did not feel anger. She felt clarity. Matthew believed he had constructed an empire. In truth, he had been entrusted with one. And trusts by design endure beyond ego. By the time the gala chandeliers illuminated polished marble floors and cameras aligned to capture Matthew's speech, the foundation beneath Hale Industries remained exactly where it had always been. In the Porter name, and in the quiet woman who carried it without announcement. The ballroom at the Latham Grand Hotel glittered with engineered perfection. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across mirrored columns. A string quartet played near the stage, where a massive screen displayed a looping timeline of Hale Industries' warehouse beginnings. Early expansion, the merger that doubled valuation. The sleek Manhattan headquarters cutting into the skyline. Investors filled the front tables. Board members clustered near the center. Executives and their spouses occupied the perimeter in curated elegance. Paige entered through a side corridor reserved for staff. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed, unremarkable. She did not take a seat. She stood near the rear wall just beyond the floral arrangements, where catering staff moved quietly between tables. A few employees recognized her and offered polite nods, confused by her presence at an executive event, but too conditioned to question hierarchy aloud. Matthew stood near the stage, framed in navy tailoring beneath calibrated spotlights. He looked composed. He always did in public. Thomas Reed leaned toward him before the program began. "Big night," Thomas murmured. Matthew smiled. 25 years. We're just getting started. The program unfolded predictably. A video montage. Applause at carefully timed intervals. Speeches from early investors praising resilience and innovation. Matthew was the final speaker. When he stepped to the podium, the room quieted into anticipatory reverence. He began with gratitude, employees, shareholders, partners. He spoke about vision-scale transformation. His voice carried confidence, shaped by repetition. Paige watched without expression. She noticed details others overlooked: the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the podium between paragraphs. Then his tone shifted. Success, Matthew said, pausing for effect, requires difficult decisions. A murmur passed through the front tables. Investors leaning forward, sensing something unscripted. Tonight, he continued, I want to be transparent, not only as a CEO, but as a man. Thomas Reed stiffened slightly in his chair. Matthew exhaled as though releasing private burden. My wife and I have grown apart. The word wife landed lightly at first. Paige did not move. Matthew continued. For years, I've balanced professional responsibility with personal compromise. I believed loyalty meant endurance. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances. But leadership, he said, voice sharpening, means knowing when to step away from what no longer aligns. He turned his gaze deliberately toward the back of the room. Spotlights followed instinctively. They found Paige. A ripple moved across the ballroom as guests traced his line of sight to a woman in facilities attire standing beside catering staff. Matthew extended his hand slightly, summoning attention, as if introducing an exhibit. This is Paige, he said evenly. My wife. Silence thickened. He let the contrast linger, tailored executives in black tie and the woman in gray uniform beneath chandeliers. I married her during a simpler time, he continued. When Hale Industries was smaller, when expectations were different. His pause carried implication. She chose a quieter path, he said, a path outside the demands of leadership. There was restrained laughter from one corner, quickly stifled. Matthew reached into his inner jacket pocket. Paige already knew what would emerge. A white envelope. For clarity, he said, lifting it slightly, I filed for divorce. An audible intake of breath moved through the audience. Because moving forward requires alignment, he added. And I cannot carry both a global corporation and a marriage rooted in charity. The word settled heavier than the others. Charity. He stepped down from the podium before applause could begin, before anyone decided whether applause was appropriate. He crossed the polished floor slowly, deliberate in his stride. Cameras tracked him instinctively. A few guests raised phones uncertainly, sensing spectacle. Paige remained still. Matthew stopped an arm's length from her. The distance was formal, performative. I hope you'll accept this with dignity, he said, quietly enough to appear private, but loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. He extended the envelope. The seal was unbroken. Paige looked at it for a measured second before taking it in both hands. Her fingers did not tremble. She did not look at Matthew immediately. Instead, she examined the envelope's edge, as though assessing its weight. Then she met his eyes. There was no accusation there, no pleading. Only recognition. Matthew interpreted her silence as shock. He mistook stillness for weakness. Around them, executives attempted to recalibrate the room's mood. A few whispered reassurances to investors. The quartet faltered, then resumed uncertainly. Thomas Reed rose halfway from his chair, uncertain whether to intervene, but Matthew's posture discouraged interference. He believed he was demonstrating control, closing a chapter cleanly, decisively, publicly. Paige finally spoke. Thank you for informing me, she said. Her voice was calm, not loud, not soft, simply steady. Matthew nodded once, as if concluding a negotiation. He turned and walked back toward the stage, reclaiming the spotlight, as though nothing irreversible had occurred. But irreversibility had already been set in motion long before this night. 2 weeks earlier, when a draft of the divorce petition had been circulated among Matthew's legal team, one associate forwarded a courtesy copy to an external contact for background research. That contact had once provided compliance audits for Hale Industries. He also maintained a professional relationship with the Porter Trust's legal counsel. Information travels efficiently when interests intersect. Victoria Langford received notice 48 hours after the draft was prepared. Paige received it within 72. She had read the petition carefully at her kitchen counter while Matthew attended an investor dinner. Matthew sought equitable distribution of marital assets, including appreciation in value of all jointly benefited corporate holdings. He believed majority shares, though technically held in trust, could be argued as marital growth given his executive leadership during the marriage. It was a bold argument. It was also structurally flawed. Paige had not confronted him. Instead, she scheduled an appointment in Boston and requested certified copies of every trust amendment, every dividend distribution, every ledger entry confirming non-commingling. She did not cry. She did not accuse. She prepared. Now, beneath chandeliers and watchful eyes, Matthew believed he had seized narrative control. He returned to the podium and resumed speaking about the company's future as if the interruption had been strategic transparency. Applause eventually surfaced thin at first, then stronger as investors chose stability over discomfort. Paige remained near the back wall until the speech concluded. No one approached her immediately. Some avoided her gaze out of embarrassment. Others studied her with sudden curiosity, recalculating assumptions formed over years. She slipped the envelope into her uniform pocket without opening it. Opening it would have suggested discovery. There was nothing to discover. When the event shifted into mingling and champagne refills, Paige exited through the same service corridor she had entered. No cameras followed. In the quiet hallway beyond the ballroom, fluorescent lights hummed with indifferent constancy. She walked steadily, neither hurried nor delayed. In the elevator reserved for staff, she allowed herself one exhale. Not of grief, of confirmation. Matthew had chosen a public stage for private severance. He believed humiliation weakened opposition. He did not understand that humiliation, when undeserved, clarifies resolve. By the time she reached the hotel's side exit and stepped into the cool Manhattan night, notifications were already traveling. Legal teams alerted trustees, informed preliminary filings cross-checked. The divorce petition would be formally served within days. The trust documentation was already in motion. Matthew remained inside the ballroom, shaking hands, assuring investors, basking in the illusion that he had simplified his life. He did not yet comprehend the scale of what he had attempted to divide, and the room that applauded him had no idea that the quiet woman who had just walked into the night held authority over every illuminated floor of the building they celebrated. Paige did not look back at the hotel. She walked toward a waiting car arranged earlier that afternoon, not by Matthew's assistant, but by Victoria's office. Because the public humiliation had been theatrical. But the response would be procedural. And procedure, unlike spectacle, does not require applause. The envelope remained unopened on the kitchen counter until morning. Matthew returned to the penthouse after midnight, smelling faintly of champagne and cologne, satisfied with how the evening had concluded. He did not mention the moment on stage. He did not ask whether Paige had read the papers. He assumed inevitability. Paige had already memorized the contents. At 7:30 a.m., while Matthew was in the shower preparing for a series of media calls, Paige placed the envelope into her leather briefcase and left the apartment. She did not go to Hale Industries. She went to Boston. Victoria Langford's office occupied the 12th floor of a restored federal-style building overlooking the harbor. The firm specialized in corporate governance, trust law, and high-value asset protection. Its clients rarely appeared in tabloids. They appeared in court filings that reshaped industries. Victoria greeted Paige without surprise. "You expected this," Victoria said, gesturing toward the envelope once they were seated. "Yes," Paige answered. Victoria opened the documents with deliberate calm. She read silently for several minutes, turning pages with precise fingers. "He's claiming marital appreciation," she said finally. "He's arguing that while the shares were acquired before marriage, their increased value during the marriage is subject to equitable distribution because of his leadership." Paige folded her hands. "Is that viable?" "In theory, it can be argued," Victoria replied. "In practice, it depends on whether those shares were ever commingled with marital assets or influenced directly by joint decision-making." "They were not," Paige said. Victoria nodded. "I know. But we will need proof. Thorough proof." Proof was something Paige had been collecting long before the gala. Victoria outlined the strategy with measured clarity. First, she said, we establish classification. The Porter Trust must be demonstrated as irrevocable, premarital, and separate. Second, we produce a complete accounting of dividends and distributions to show they remained within trust-managed accounts. Third, we anticipate his attempt to argue active management. Paige listened without interruption. He will claim Victoria continued that as CEO, his executive decisions materially increase the value of the company, and therefore the value of your shares. That is partially true, Paige said quietly. The company expanded significantly under his tenure. Victoria's eyes sharpened. Expansion does not equal entitlement. The shares existed before him. Governance provisions existed before him. The trust's veto rights shaped the company's risk tolerance long before he signed his first executive contract. Paige nodded once. Additionally, Victoria added, sliding a legal pad across the table, we should prepare for disclosure. Of my identity, Paige said. Yes, the Porter Trust had maintained anonymity for decades. But a contested divorce involving a $50 billion corporation made anonymity fragile. If the court demands it, Victoria said, we will disclose on our terms. Paige absorbed that. Disclosure was not fear. It was inevitability. What about his legal representation, Paige asked. Charles Dunham. Victoria replied without hesitation. He's already filed notice of appearance. Paige recognized the name. Dunham was aggressive in high-asset divorces, known for framing narratives that appealed to emotional equity as much as legal technicality. He will try to portray you as a passive beneficiary, Victoria continued, someone whose wealth increased because of Matthew's labor. Paige considered that. Then we demonstrate I was not passive, she said. Victoria studied her carefully. Are you prepared for scrutiny? Yes. Back in Manhattan, Matthew met with Charles Dunham in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Park Avenue. She's not going to fight, Matthew said confidently. She doesn't understand the structure. Charles adjusted his cufflinks. Understand this, when numbers reach this scale, even passive parties acquire capable counsel. Matthew dismissed the warning. The majority shareholder is some institutional entity. It's complicated, but it's not personal. Charles did not respond immediately. Complication, in his experience, often concealed leverage. Meanwhile, Victoria's team began assembling documentation. Certified copies of the original 32-year-old investment agreement. Amendments confirming irrevocability. Bank statements showing dividend deposits into trust-only accounts, untouched by marital spending. Tax filings verifying separate property classification. Every ledger entry was indexed. Paige contributed more than access. She provided notes. Her leather notebook dates, overheard conversations, references to proposed restructuring plans became context for potential corporate maneuvering relevant to the divorce. Victoria flipped through its pages. You anticipated governance shifts, she observed. Yes. You suspected he might dilute equity. Yes. Victoria closed the notebook slowly. Paige, this is not retaliation. No, Paige agreed. It's preservation. The difference mattered. In the days following, the gala media coverage focused briefly on Matthew's public announcement. Headlines framed it as a decisive CEO prioritizing leadership. Some questioned the optics. Most moved on to quarterly earnings projections. No journalist connected the divorce to majority ownership. Not yet. Paige returned to work at Hale Industries the following Monday. Her uniform remained unchanged. Elevator conversations paused briefly when she entered. Whispers trailed behind her in corridors. But corporate culture discourages overt curiosity. Employees returned to spreadsheets and conference calls. Matthew avoided her physically. He extended his hours at the office, filling his schedule with strategic meetings. In private, he instructed Charles to accelerate proceedings. I want this finalized quickly, he said, before year-end. Charles reviewed financial summaries provided by Matthew's team. There's something you should examine. Charles said during their second meeting. He slid a preliminary shareholder ledger across the table. 62% is held through the Porter Trust, Charles noted. Yes, Matthew replied impatiently. "They've never interfered." "Do you know who the beneficiary is? It's irrelevant." Charles held his gaze. "It may not be." Matthew waved it off. "We're arguing appreciation, not identity. But identity in corporate structure often determines leverage." Victoria filed a formal response to the divorce petition within 10 days. The response was restrained, precise. It contested classification of the shares and requested comprehensive financial disclosure from Matthew, including compensation packages, bonus structures, and equity grants. Matthew read the filing in his office late at night. "She's overreaching," he muttered. Charles shook his head slightly. "She's defending." Simultaneously, Victoria prepared a motion requesting temporary injunction against any restructuring that would materially alter share distribution until divorce proceedings concluded. The motion cited potential conflict of interest if executive decisions affected contested assets. Matthew received notice of the motion during a board strategy session. He masked irritation beneath composure. "This is procedural," he assured Thomas Reed afterward. "Legal housekeeping." Thomas studied him. "Is there anything the board should be aware of?" No, Matthew answered smoothly. Across town, Paige met Victoria again to review upcoming court scheduling. "There will be a preliminary hearing within 6 weeks, Victoria said. The judge assigned is Eleanor Whitaker." Paige recognized the name. Judge Whitaker was known for meticulous attention to asset classification in high-net-worth cases. "She won't be swayed by theatrics," Victoria added. Paige allowed herself the faintest acknowledgement of irony. Matthew had chosen theatrics. Paige had chosen the records. As she left the Boston office that afternoon, harbor winds sharp against her coat, Paige felt no triumph. Divorce was not a victory. It was dissolution. But dissolution reveals composition. Matthew believed he was dividing inconvenience from ambition. He did not yet understand that the structure supporting his authority would now be examined under oath. And structures, unlike speeches, cannot be revised mid-performance. By the time the court convened, every bank transfer, every trust clause, every corporate amendment would be placed in sequence. Matthew had initiated separation publicly. Paige would respond legally. And the difference between spectacle and statute was about to become undeniable. The executive suite on the 42nd floor of Hale Industries was insulated in more ways than one. Soundproof glass, restricted keycard access, private elevators calibrated to Matthew Hale's biometric profile. He believed confidentiality lived in architecture. It did not. 2 weeks after the gala, Matthew convened a closed-door strategy session with CFO Robert Klein and external counsel retained for corporate restructuring. The divorce had not altered his forward momentum. If anything, it sharpened it. "We accelerate," Matthew said, standing at the head of the long walnut conference table. "We move before markets cool." Robert hesitated. "The dilution plan requires majority shareholder consent." "They've never denied us anything," Matthew replied flatly. "They don't engage." Robert glanced down at his tablet. "We've never tested that assumption." Matthew's jaw tightened. "We're issuing new equity," he said. "Strategic expansion. It's standard." "It reduces their percentage," Robert added carefully. "It reduces everyone's percentage." That was technically true. But scale does not erase impact. Later that evening, after the consultants had left, and the building's lights dimmed into after-hours quiet, Matthew remained in his office. He drafted an email to Robert marked "Confidential Strategic Considerations." He typed deliberately. "We need to identify the controlling entity behind the Porter Trust. If they're institutional, we negotiate buyback. If foreign, we apply regulatory pressure. We cannot allow an inactive majority to constrain growth." He paused, then added, "Discretion is critical." He pressed send. Downstairs on the 38th floor, Paige was emptying recycling bins outside the marketing department. Her shift officially ended at 7:00 p.m., but she often stayed later under the pretext of thoroughness. Her keycard granted her access to maintenance terminals connected to internal compliance systems, access approved years earlier under the authority of majority shareholder oversight, though few remembered that origin. Through trustee authorization, Paige retained read-only visibility into executive communications, flagged for governance review. The email surfaced automatically. She read it without visible reaction. She did not print it. She did not forward it immediately. She archived it into a secure digital folder maintained through Victoria's firm. It was not the first message of its kind. Over the past 3 months, Matthew's correspondence had grown increasingly impatient with what he described as a structural drag. He referred to the Porter Trust as an obstacle rather than a safeguard. In another exchange from earlier that week, Robert had responded cautiously, "We should be careful about pursuing identity. The trust's anonymity is legally protected." Matthew replied, "Legal protections shift under pressure." Paige copied that line into her notebook that night. Legal protections shift under pressure. The phrase was revealing. It suggested intent not merely to grow the company, but to weaken the entity designed to preserve its long-term stability. In Boston, Victoria reviewed the forwarded email the next morning. "He's considering coercive measures," she said quietly during their secure call. "Yes," Paige replied. Victoria leaned back in her chair. "This strengthens our injunction argument. If he attempts dilution while contesting asset classification, it becomes conflict of interest." Paige's voice remained steady. "Will the court see it that way, if we present it properly?" Victoria answered. Meanwhile, Matthew scheduled a secondary meeting with Robert in the executive lounge, away from conference rooms wired for official minutes. "We can't wait for consent," Matthew said, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. Robert accepted his, but did not drink. "There's risk," Robert said. "If the majority pushes back, markets could interpret instability." "They won't push back," Matthew insisted. "They never have." Robert hesitated before speaking again. "Do you know who they are?" Matthew exhaled sharply. "It's irrelevant." "It might not be," Robert replied carefully. Matthew's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you questioning leadership?" "I'm questioning exposure," Robert said. Matthew dismissed the concern with a wave. "Draft preliminary models for issuance at 10%. Quietly. Robert nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his expression. Uncertainty was something Matthew increasingly interpreted as disloyalty. The following week, an internal memorandum circulated among select executives outlining potential equity expansion scenarios. It was marked preliminary, not for distribution. Paige accessed the document through governance oversight privileges. She read each projection line by line. 10% issuance, projected market reaction, estimated shift in voting power. Though the trust would remain majority at 55.8% post-dilution, the precedent of unilateral movement during contested divorce proceedings carried weight. It demonstrated intent. And intent mattered in both corporate and family court. Paige scheduled another meeting with Victoria. "This is escalation," Victoria said after reviewing the projections. "Yes," Paige replied. "He's attempting to create momentum before judicial review," Victoria continued. "If shares are diluted before classification is settled, he complicates valuation." "Can he do that?" Paige asked. "Not without risk," Victoria answered, "especially if we file for emergency relief." Paige considered the timeline. The preliminary hearing was 3 weeks away. "File," she said. Victoria did not smile. She simply nodded. That afternoon, a motion for temporary restraining order was filed in New York Supreme Court, citing risk of irreparable harm to marital asset determination and potential breach of fiduciary duty. Matthew received notice during a quarterly forecasting call. He muted the conference line and scanned the filing summary. "She's overreacting," he muttered. Charles Dunham responded calmly. "She's anticipating." "This is business," Matthew said, "not personal." In divorce proceedings involving controlling interest in a $50 billion corporation, Charles replied, "Business is personal." Matthew leaned back in his chair, irritation rising. He had believed Paige disengaged from the company's complexities, that she lacked appetite for corporate confrontation. He underestimated observation. That evening, after most employees had left, Paige walked through the executive corridor carrying a stack of folded linens. She paused briefly outside Matthew's office. The door was closed. Light glowed beneath it. Inside, Matthew paced while speaking to Charles on speakerphone. "We'll argue executive discretion," Matthew said. "The board supports expansion." "Board support does not override fiduciary obligations," Charles answered, "especially if majority consent is contested." Matthew stopped pacing. "The majority is silent." "For now," Charles said. Silence, in Matthew's experience, implied weakness. In Paige's, it implied patience. The next morning, Robert Klein requested a private meeting with Matthew before markets opened. "This is moving quickly," Robert said. "If the court grants the restraining order, it signals doubt to investors." Matthew's expression hardened. "We project confidence. Confidence without clarity becomes volatility," Robert replied. Matthew did not appreciate caution when it contradicted his timeline. Across the river in Boston, Victoria finalized supporting exhibits for the court motion email correspondence dilution model's timeline of divorce filing trust documentation. Each document aligned sequentially. Each suggested pattern. Paige reviewed the packet once before submission. She did not feel vindicated. She felt precise. That evening, as Manhattan lights flickered against dark water, Paige stood again at the penthouse window. Matthew had not returned home yet. On the dining table lay two parallel stacks of paper, his divorce petition and her response filings. Parallel, but not equal. Matthew believed expansion required pressure. He believed structures bent under force. He did not understand that some structures were built specifically to withstand it. And now, through emails, he assumed private and strategies he believed undiscovered. He had revealed something more consequential than ambition. He had revealed disregard for boundaries he did not comprehend. The court would examine that. The board would sense it. And the anonymous majority shareholder he dismissed as inactive had begun to move not loudly, not publicly, but through channels designed decades earlier for exactly this purpose. Matthew still believed he was steering the company's trajectory. He did not yet see that governance was tightening around him, not as retaliation, but as response. And responses, when documented properly, carry more weight than declarations ever could. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was designed to communicate permanence. A single slab of dark walnut stretched nearly the length of the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Hudson in steel-blue winter light. On one wall hung a timeline of Hale Industries photographs of the Newark warehouse. Early factory floors, ribbon cuttings, stock exchange celebrations. Matthew preferred to sit at the head of the table backlit by the skyline. The emergency board meeting was called for 8:00 a.m., 3 days after Victoria filed the motion for a temporary restraining order. Officially, the agenda concerned strategic capital optimization. Unofficially, tension had begun to ripple beneath quarterly projections. Thomas Reed arrived first, carrying a leather portfolio worn smooth at the edges. He had served on the board for 18 years, long enough to remember when the Porter Trust's representative attended meetings in person, long before anonymity became routine. Robert Klein entered next, quieter than usual. Matthew arrived precisely at 7:58 a.m. Composed Navy suit immaculate. "Let's keep this efficient," he said as he took his seat. "Markets open in 30 minutes. Directors filed in, murmuring polite greetings. Legal counsel for the corporation joined via secure video link. Paige entered at 8:05 a.m. She wore the same gray facilities uniform she had worn for years. She carried a small bin of sanitized glasses, a neutral pretext for presence. A few board members glanced at her reflexively before returning to their tablets. No one asked why she remained inside after placing the glasses on the side credenza. Matthew noticed her only after beginning his presentation. He paused briefly, irritation flickering across his expression. "This is a closed session," he said, not looking directly at her. Thomas Reed cleared his throat. Facilities clearance has been pre-approved under governance protocol, he said evenly. Matthew's gaze shifted toward Thomas. For maintenance. Thomas held his look. Governance protocol. The distinction was subtle. Matthew continued. He projected slides outlining projected growth in Southeast Asia capital requirements for acquisition targets and the proposed 10% equity issuance. Our valuation remains strong, he said. Issuing limited shares now positions us for exponential expansion. A director near the far end of the table asked, "Have we secured consent from the majority shareholder?" Matthew's response was smooth. Historically, they have not interfered with strategic initiatives. That's not the question, the director replied. Robert shifted in his chair. Thomas Reed folded his hands. We've received notice of pending litigation related to share classification, he said carefully. Shouldn't we await judicial clarity? Matthew's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The litigation concerns personal matters, he said. It does not impede corporate discretion. Corporate counsel's voice crackled through the speaker. There is risk if actions materially alter asset value. During contested divorce proceedings, Matthew resisted visible impatience. We cannot paralyze growth because of private disputes, he said. At the back of the room, Paige stood motionless beside the credenza. She listened. She had already reviewed every slide in advance. She knew which directors hesitated and which aligned reflexively with Matthew's momentum. Thomas turned slightly in his chair. The Porter Trust holds 62%, he said quietly. If they object, this does not pass. They won't, Matthew replied. Confidence, when repeated often enough, begins to resemble certainty, even to the speaker. Thomas's eyes drifted briefly toward Paige. It was not recognition. It was curiosity. Paige met his gaze without expression, then lowered her eyes, as if returning to invisible duties. Matthew advanced to the final slide. I'm calling for preliminary board approval, he said. Pending formal consent procedures. The phrasing was strategic approval before consent, momentum before scrutiny. Robert spoke for the first time in several minutes. Matthew, he said carefully, we should consider timing. The court may view issuance as an attempt to influence valuation. Matthew's voice cooled. We're not structuring our capital strategy around optics. No, Robert replied softly. But optics affect markets. The silence lingered. Thomas leaned back. I recommend postponement until after the preliminary hearing. A murmur of agreement moved along one side of the table. Matthew's fingers drummed once against polished wood. We lose advantage, he said. We preserve stability, Thomas countered. The debate remained measured, professional. No one raised their voice. But power shifted in increments measured not in decibels, but in hesitation. Paige observed the pattern. Matthew was accustomed to deference. Today, deference thinned. Finally, Thomas suggested a vote on postponement. Matthew's eyes hardened. Very well, he said. Hands lifted slowly. Majority favored delay. Not defeat. Delay. Matthew inclined his head once as if the outcome were inconsequential. Fine, he said. We reconvene after the hearing. The meeting adjourned with restrained civility. Directors gathered their materials and filed out conversations, hushed but pointed. Robert lingered briefly. We should be cautious, he said to Matthew once the room emptied. I am cautious, Matthew replied. Robert held his gaze. Are you certain you know who you're negotiating against? Matthew's expression flickered with irritation. An absentee trust. Robert did not argue further. Outside the boardroom, Paige waited until the last director exited before retrieving the untouched glasses from the credenza. As she turned to leave, Thomas Reed approached her. Paige, he said gently. She paused. I wasn't aware facilities required presence during board deliberations, he added. She met his eyes calmly. Governance protocol permits observation under majority shareholder authority. Thomas's brow furrowed slightly. Majority shareholder authority, he repeated. Yes, she answered. There was no emphasis, no explanation. Thomas studied her for a second longer than necessary. Of course, he said finally. He walked away slowly, mind recalibrating. Downstairs, news of the postponed issuance circulated discreetly through executive channels. Analysts noticed no immediate change. Markets opened normally. But internally, something had shifted. Matthew returned to his office and closed the door with more force than usual. He called Charles Dunham immediately. "They're hesitating," Matthew said. "Because of optics, because of risk," Charles corrected gently. "I will not allow an anonymous shareholder to dictate pace," Matthew said. Charles paused before responding. "You may not have a choice." Across the building, Paige returned to her maintenance locker and removed her uniform jacket. She folded it neatly. Inside her bag, her phone vibrated with a message from Victoria. "Board postponed issuance. Good sign." Paige typed a single reply. As expected, she did not smile. This was not victory. It was alignment. Matthew believed authority flowed downward from title. Paige understood that authority, when rooted in ownership, flowed upward from structure. The board had not yet learned the identity of the majority shareholder, but they had felt its gravity. And gravity does not announce itself loudly. It simply holds everything in place. As twilight settled over Manhattan, Matthew stood once more before his office window's skyline, reflecting in glass. He believed he still controlled trajectory. He did not yet recognize the narrowing corridor of options forming quietly around him. The next stage would not unfold in boardrooms. It would unfold under oath. And their spectacle would yield entirely to record. The first subpoena arrived on a Thursday morning. It was delivered not to the penthouse nor to Hale Industries, but to a private banking institution in Boston that had managed the Porter Trust for over 3 decades. Victoria Langford had anticipated resistance from Matthew's legal team. What she anticipated more precisely was curiosity. Curiosity about money leaves fingerprints. By noon, certified copies of 15 years of bank records were being prepared under court order, every dividend distribution, every reinvestment, every untouched balance sheet, confirming separation from marital accounts. Paige sat in Victoria's office 2 days later as thick binders were placed on the conference table between them. 15 years, Victoria said, flipping open the first binder. Quarterly statements, trustee certifications, no commingling, no transfers into joint accounts. Paige scanned the pages without visible emotion. Each document represented something Matthew had never bothered to examine. Not because it was hidden, because he assumed it irrelevant. Victoria turned to another tab. This is important. It was a premarital asset declaration Paige had signed before her wedding at Victoria's insistence, though Matthew had treated it as unnecessary formality. Matthew had skimmed it at the time, confident in his own upward trajectory. He had not focused on the appendix listing non-disclosable trust interests. Now that appendix carried weight. He acknowledged separate property status, Victoria said quietly. In writing. Paige remembered the moment clearly. Matthew had signed, quickly distracted by wedding logistics. "You're very thorough," he had said with a half smile. "But we won't need lawyers in this marriage." Paige had returned the smile. Now that signature rested beneath certified ink. Across town, Charles Dunham reviewed preliminary disclosures forwarded by the bank under subpoena. He frowned. "This is cleaner than I expected," he told Matthew during their meeting. Matthew leaned forward in his leather chair. Cleaner how no intermingling. Dividends remained inside trust accounts. No transfers into marital holdings. Matthew exhaled sharply. Value increased during marriage. "Yes," Charles said carefully. "But appreciation of separate property remains separate, unless active contribution transforms classification." "I actively built the company," Matthew insisted. "You were compensated for that role," Charles replied. "Substantially." He slid another document across the desk. Matthew's executive compensation packages, salary bonuses, equity grants, awarded independently from the Porter Trust shares. "You've already been paid for performance," Charles added. Matthew's jaw tightened. He had never considered his salary as counterweight to appreciation. To him, growth equaled ownership. But law did not equate them so simply. Meanwhile, Victoria prepared a financial summary chart that traced the Porter Trust's holdings from inception to present day. The timeline revealed something subtle, yet powerful. The Trust's majority position had remained consistent long before Matthew became CEO. Yes, valuation accelerated under his tenure, Victoria acknowledged. But the structural majority existed independent of him. Paige studied the graph. Lines rising over decades, foundations preceding her marriage, stability predating Matthew's leadership. Will the court understand this, she asked. Judge Whitaker understands structure, Victoria replied. She will follow chronology, Paige nodded once. That afternoon, an unexpected development unfolded at Hale Industries. Robert Klein requested a private review of historical capital contributions as part of internal compliance refresh, an action triggered quietly by governance anxiety. While reviewing archived financial summaries from the company's earliest years, Robert noticed something he had overlooked before the magnitude of the Porter capital injection. He called Matthew immediately. "You knew the original investment was controlling, right?" Robert asked cautiously. "Of course," Matthew replied. "It was significant." "It was majority," Robert said. Matthew paused. "Yes," he answered, "temporarily." Robert hesitated. "There's no record of dilution large enough to change that." Matthew's silence lasted longer this time. "Find the most recent shareholder registry," he said finally. Within an hour, a digital ledger appeared on Matthew's screen. Porter Trust, 62%. Matthew stared at the number. He had seen it countless times in quarterly summaries. But context changes numbers. He had always assumed the trust passive. He had never examined its beneficiary. He called Charles again. "Who exactly controls the Porter Trust?" he asked. Charles hesitated. "That's part of what we're attempting to determine," he said. "Attempting," Matthew repeated sharply. "Trust anonymity is robust," Charles explained. "But given the divorce proceedings, disclosure may be compelled." Matthew leaned back slowly. "You think Paige knows something about this?" Charles chose his words carefully. "She appears well represented." That evening, as Manhattan rain streaked against the penthouse windows, Matthew opened his laptop and searched internal governance archives more thoroughly than he ever had before. He requested archived board minutes from 10 years prior. He reviewed trustee correspondence summaries. Patterns emerged: subtle approvals, quiet vetoes of risk-heavy proposals, long before he assumed leadership. He had attributed those decisions to conservative board members. He had not traced them to majority authority. For the first time, doubt threaded through his certainty. Down the hall, Paige sat at the dining table reviewing updated financial summaries Victoria had sent via encrypted channel. The rain softened the city's edges. She heard Matthew pacing in his office. She did not interrupt. Her phone vibrated with a message from Victoria. Court granted temporary injunction. No share issuance until after preliminary hearing. Paige closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, in confirmation. The injunction meant Matthew's attempt to dilute equity had been formally paused. Intent had been acknowledged. Procedure had intervened. In his office, Matthew read the same court order minutes later. His expression darkened. "She's coordinating this," he muttered to himself. He walked into the dining area where Paige sat. For a moment, they stood across from each other without speaking. "Did you know about the injunction before I did?" he asked finally. Paige met his gaze evenly. "I'm aware of court filings," she said. Matthew studied her face. "You've been more involved than I realized." She did not answer that directly. "You filed for divorce," she replied calmly. "Legal involvement follows." He exhaled sharply. "You think you understand corporate strategy?" he asked. "I understand structure," she said. There was no accusation in her tone, only fact. Matthew returned to his office without further comment. That night, sleep eluded him. For the first time since the gala, he replayed events not as performance, but as sequence. Public announcement, legal response, injunction, bank records, majority percentage. The narrative he had scripted began to fracture. Across the apartment, Paige placed the binders back into her briefcase. Bank records did not lie. They did not exaggerate. They did not humiliate. They simply existed. And existence, when documented thoroughly, outweighs assertion. The preliminary hearing loomed closer. Matthew still believed he could argue contribution. But numbers have memory, and the memory embedded in 15 years of untouched accounts was precise. By the time the courtroom doors opened, valuation would not be a matter of opinion. It would be ledgered. And for the first time, Matthew would be required to confront not just marital dissolution, but the origin of the empire he believed solely his. The recording was never meant to matter. It had been captured on a quiet evening 3 months before the gala in a private dining room at the Alder Room, a restaurant favored by executives who preferred dim lighting and discretion. Matthew had been celebrating what he believed was a turning point early investor interest in expanding Hale Industries into sovereign infrastructure contracts overseas. Across the table sat an old college friend, Jonathan Pierce, now a venture capitalist with a taste for bold projections and louder opinions. The wine had flowed freely. Confidence, when mixed with affirmation, often loosens restraint. Jonathan had asked casually, "Does your wife ever push back on expansion?" Matthew had laughed. "Paige," he said, "she owns nothing. I built everything." The sentence had not been rehearsed. It had been reflex. "She's comfortable," he continued. "I gave her a good life. But she doesn't understand scale. I won't let anyone slow this down, not a passive investor, not even her." Jonathan chuckled. "Sounds like you've got full control." "I do," Matthew replied. "Majority shareholders don't interfere if you keep dividends strong. And at home, she's just there." What Matthew did not realize was that Jonathan, meticulous in his own financial dealings, recorded many of his business dinners as habit and audio log he kept for note-taking and liability protection. The recording was legal. New York was a one-party consent state. Jonathan had no reason to revisit the file until headlines surfaced about Matthew's public divorce announcement. He listened again out of curiosity. The phrase struck differently in retrospect. She owns nothing. Jonathan understood capitalization structures. He knew the Porter Trust existed. He also knew markets reacted sharply to executive overconfidence. He forwarded the clip not to media, but to a mutual legal contact concerned about potential exposure. Within 48 hours, the audio reached Victoria Langford's office. Victoria listened without visible reaction. Then she called Paige. "Where was this recorded?" Paige asked. 3 months ago, Victoria replied. "Private dinner. Legally obtained." Paige absorbed the information in silence. It was not the insult that mattered. It was the assertion. She owns nothing. The statement contradicted documented reality, and contradiction under oath carried consequence. "Will it help?" Paige asked. Victoria considered carefully. "It demonstrates intent and belief," she said. "If he argues in court that he understood the trust structure fully, this undermines that claim." Paige nodded slowly. Matthew had built his legal argument around active contribution and informed partnership. The recording revealed dismissal, not partnership. Victoria added the file to their evidentiary index. Meanwhile, Matthew sensed a shift he could not yet define. Board members had grown cautious. Robert Klein had become measured in tone. Charles Dunham requested more frequent meetings. "You need to prepare for disclosure," Charles said during one late evening strategy session. Disclosure of what Matthew asked. Identity of the trust beneficiary. Matthew leaned back in his chair. "It's irrelevant to asset classification," he insisted. "It may not remain irrelevant," Charles replied. Matthew's confidence began to thin, not publicly, not visibly, but internally. He found himself revisiting old board minutes, rereading clauses he had once skimmed. The Porter Trust, irrevocable, majority. He had always equated silence with passivity. He began to question that assumption. 2 days before the preliminary hearing, Victoria scheduled a final preparation session with Paige in Boston. The conference room was quiet, except for the faint hum of harbor traffic outside. "We'll introduce the bank records first," Victoria explained. Then the trust documents. The audio may not be central, but it will contextualize his understanding. Paige listened carefully. "Will he hear it in court?" she asked. "Yes," Victoria said. There was no satisfaction in Paige's expression, only acceptance. In Manhattan, Matthew reviewed his testimony outline, drafted by Charles. Key points: significant executive contribution during marriage, growth directly attributable to strategic leadership, reasonable expectation of shared appreciation, lack of transparency regarding trust details. Stay composed, Charles advised. Focus on business growth. Matthew nodded. He believed clarity would prevail. On the morning of the hearing, rain fell steadily across lower Manhattan. The courthouse steps glistened under gray sky. Reporters had gathered, sensing high-profile proceedings tied to Hale Industries. Paige arrived through a side entrance with Victoria. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, unremarkable but precise. No cameras followed her inside. Matthew entered through the main doors, flanked by Charles. Flashes flickered briefly. Inside the courtroom, proceedings began without spectacle. Judge Eleanor Whitaker presided with calm authority. Initial arguments focused on classification of assets. Victoria presented bank records, dividend histories, and trust documentation in orderly sequence. Matthew listened as the chronology unfolded decades of ownership predating his marriage. When it was Charles's turn, he emphasized executive leadership and value acceleration. "My client transformed Hale Industries into a global powerhouse," Charles said. "The appreciation during marriage is inseparable from his labor." Judge Whitaker nodded thoughtfully. Then Victoria requested permission to introduce supplementary evidence regarding Mr. Hale's understanding of ownership structure. The audio file played through courtroom speakers. Matthew's voice echoed in controlled clarity. "She owns nothing. I built everything." Silence followed. It was not dramatic. It was measured. Matthew felt the weight of his own words settle differently in this room. He glanced briefly toward Paige. She did not look at him. Judge Whitaker turned slightly toward Charles. "Counsel," she asked. Charles cleared his throat. "The comment reflects personal frustration," he said carefully, "not legal understanding." Victoria responded calmly. "It reflects stated belief," she said, "a belief inconsistent with claims of shared asset awareness." Judge Whitaker made a note. The hearing continued structured, methodical. Something had shifted. The audio did not humiliate. It clarified. Matthew's assertion of control had been recorded months before he filed for divorce. It revealed not partnership but dismissal. By late afternoon, Judge Whitaker concluded preliminary arguments. "I will review submissions and issue determination regarding temporary asset classification and disclosure," she said. The gavel sounded softly. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Matthew exited without comment. Paige left through the side corridor again. Rain had slowed to mist. In the car back to Boston, Victoria glanced at Paige. "You held steady," she said. Paige watched water streak across the window. "This isn't about holding steady," she replied quietly. "It's about accuracy. Accuracy." The recording had not been revenge. It had been documentation. Matthew had believed words spoken in private dissolved with time. But structure preserves more than contracts. It preserves memory. And memory, when introduced under oath, becomes evidence. The next age would not revolve around belief. It would revolve around disclosure. And disclosure, once compelled, would not be reversible. The preliminary ruling was issued 10 days later. It did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived as a 42-page written opinion uploaded to the court's electronic filing system at 8:17 a.m. Victoria Langford read it in her Boston office before markets opened. Matthew Hale read it alone in his executive suite 20 minutes later. Judge Eleanor Whitaker's language was restrained, almost clinical. She affirmed the temporary injunction preventing share dilution until final classification was determined. She acknowledged Matthew's executive contributions, but emphasized that appreciation of separate property does not automatically convert into marital property absent commingling or transmutation. Then came the paragraph that shifted the center of gravity. Given the scale of ownership at issue and the potential impact on corporate governance, the court orders formal disclosure of the beneficial owner of the Porter Trust for purposes of asset classification. Disclosure. Matthew read the sentence twice. The name had never mattered to him before. Now it did. He called Charles immediately. "This is procedural," Charles said, though his tone was measured. "The court requires clarity." "You said identity wasn't central," Matthew replied sharply. "It becomes central when majority control intersects with divorce proceedings," Charles answered. Matthew ended the call without further comment. Across state lines, Paige received Victoria's call. "It's time," Victoria said. "Yes," Paige replied. They scheduled the disclosure hearing for the following week. In the days leading up to it, speculation began quietly circulating within Hale Industries. Word of the injunction had reached analysts. Questions about majority consent appeared in financial commentary. Thomas Reed requested an executive session without Matthew present. Purely governance, he assured. Matthew sensed the shift, but could not yet quantify it. At home, silence deepened between him and Paige. They occupied parallel rooms in the penthouse, speaking only when necessary. One evening, as Matthew stood by the kitchen island, reviewing market projections, he broke the quiet. "Do you know who the beneficiary is?" he asked without looking up. Paige did not answer immediately. "Yes," she said finally. Matthew lifted his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "You never asked," she replied. The simplicity unsettled him more than accusation would have. The morning of the disclosure hearing, the courtroom was fuller. Reporters sensed narrative acceleration. Victoria arrived carrying a sealed envelope and certified trust documents. Paige walked beside her, composed in a navy suit. Matthew entered through the main corridor, posture rigid. Judge Whitaker convened proceedings promptly. "This session concerns compliance with court-ordered disclosure," she began. Victoria rose. "Your Honor, the Porter Trust documentation has been submitted under seal for review. I am prepared to state the identity of the sole beneficiary on record." The room quieted. Matthew's breathing slowed, almost imperceptibly. Victoria's voice remained steady. "The sole beneficiary of the Porter Trust, holding 62% controlling interest in Hale Industries, is Paige Porter." The name settled into the room without echo. Matthew did not react immediately. He blinked once as though recalibrating sound. Judge Whitaker looked toward Paige. "Miss Porter," she said, "please stand." Paige rose. No flourish, no emphasis, just confirmation. Matthew's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table. He turned toward her fully for the first time since the gala. "You," he said under his breath. Paige met his gaze evenly. "Yes." The courtroom remained silent. There were no gasps, only the quiet rearrangement of understanding. Judge Whitaker addressed the record. "The court acknowledges that majority ownership of Hale Industries resides with Miss Porter through premarital irrevocable trust. This significantly informs asset classification and governance considerations." Charles rose slowly. "Your Honor," he began carefully, "while we acknowledge the beneficiary's identity, we maintain that Mr. Hale's executive contributions materially increased the company's value." Judge Whitaker nodded. "That argument remains under review," she said. "However, ownership interest predating marriage carries significant weight." Matthew felt something unfamiliar then, not humiliation, not anger, displacement. He had built his authority on the belief that leadership equaled control. Now control had a documented owner. Outside the courtroom, news traveled faster than commentary could shape it. Majority shareholder revealed as CEO's wife appeared across financial feeds within minutes. Hale Industries stock fluctuated briefly before stabilizing. Inside the courtroom, proceedings continued methodically. Victoria presented the original 32-year-old investment agreement trustee, succession documents, and dividend ledgers. Each page reinforced continuity. Matthew listened as decades of structure unfolded structure he had benefited from without fully examining. He remembered conversations with his father about early investors. He remembered being told they were quiet but supportive. He had never pressed further. Judge Whitaker requested clarification. "Miss Porter," she asked, "have you exercised direct control over corporate operations?" Paige answered calmly, "No, Your Honor." Operational leadership remained with Mr. Hale and the executive team. The trust retained veto authority over structural changes. "Have you intervened prior to these proceedings, only to preserve governance provisions when necessary?" Matthew absorbed each word. She had not undermined him. She had safeguarded structure. The hearing concluded with the court affirming that the Porter Trust shares constituted separate property, not subject to division, pending final ruling on appreciation arguments. But the center had shifted irrevocably. Ownership was no longer abstract. It had a face. After adjournment, reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Matthew declined comment. Paige exited through the side entrance again. In the car, Victoria glanced at her. "This changes everything," Victoria said quietly. Paige looked out at the city moving beyond the window. "It clarifies everything," she replied. Back at Hale Industries, Thomas Reed convened an emergency board call. With disclosure complete, he said, "We must reassess governance alignment." Robert Klein listened carefully. Matthew joined the call late. No one referenced the gala. No one mentioned humiliation. They spoke only of fiduciary responsibility. Matthew felt the shift in tone. Deference had dissolved into evaluation. For the first time, he occupied the room not as presumed owner, but as executive under majority authority. That evening, as twilight settled over Manhattan, Matthew stood alone in his office. The skyline remained unchanged. But perspective alters landscapes. Across town, Paige removed her blazer and folded it carefully over a chair. Disclosure had not been triumph. It had been inevitability. Power when quiet often goes unnoticed until named. Now it had been named. And names once spoken in court do not return to anonymity. The next stage would not be about who owned the company. That had been answered. It would be about who should lead it. And leadership, unlike ownership, requires trust. Trust Matthew had begun to erode long before he realized it was never his alone. The silence inside Hale Industries the morning after the disclosure felt different. Not louder, heavier. Executives who once greeted Matthew with easy confidence now measured their tone. Conversations paused when he entered, not out of admiration, but recalibration. Majority ownership had a name now. Paige Porter. And names alter gravity. Thomas Reed arrived at headquarters before sunrise. He requested a closed executive session for the board at 9:00 a.m., citing fiduciary alignment following court disclosure. Matthew received the notice on his phone while reviewing overnight market summaries. He stared at the phrase fiduciary alignment longer than necessary. At 8:30 a.m., Paige entered through the service corridor as she always had. Her uniform remained the same. Gray shirt, navy slacks, facilities badge. She passed clusters of employees whispering near the elevators. Some recognized her now, not as background presence, but as controlling shareholder. Eyes lingered. No one approached her directly. She did not alter her pace. In the boardroom, directors gathered without the usual pre-meeting small talk. Robert Klein reviewed financial projections on his tablet. Thomas Reed organized printed copies of the Porter Trust governance clauses. Matthew entered precisely at 9. He nodded once at the group and took his seat at the head of the table. Thomas cleared his throat. "We need to address structural leadership in light of yesterday's disclosure," he began. Matthew's expression remained neutral. "The majority shareholder has been identified," Thomas continued. "That changes our accountability framework." "I am still CEO," Matthew said evenly. "Yes," Thomas replied. "And the board remains responsible for oversight." Robert spoke next carefully. Markets stabilized after disclosure, but analysts are raising questions about internal alignment. Matthew's jaw tightened slightly. Alignment with whom, he asked. Thomas answered directly, "With the majority shareholder." Matthew leaned back in his chair. "And has she expressed dissatisfaction?" he asked. The room remained quiet for a moment. "No," Thomas said. "But fiduciary responsibility requires us to evaluate stability." Matthew understood subtext. The issue was not expressed dissatisfaction. It was potential divergence. At that exact moment, Paige stood outside the boardroom door, polishing the brass handle, as if unaware of the conversation within. She could hear faint tones, but not words. She did not need them. Inside, Thomas placed a document at the center of the table. "This is the company's original governance charter," he said. "It grants majority authority the power to call for leadership review if strategic decisions conflict with long-term stability." Matthew looked at the document. He had read it once years ago. He had not considered it active. Robert added quietly, "The attempted share dilution during pending litigation raised concerns." "It was strategic," Matthew said. "It was contested," Thomas corrected. Silence settled again. "Has Miss Porter requested leadership review?" Matthew asked. "No," Thomas replied. That answer hung in the air, because she did not need to. Outside, Paige finished polishing the handle and stepped away just as the door opened. Thomas exited first and paused briefly when he saw her. "Miss Porter," he said softly. She inclined her head. "We'll be scheduling a follow-up session," he added. "I'm aware," she replied. Thomas studied her expression. There was no triumph there, no expectation, just steadiness. He nodded once and walked past her. Inside the boardroom, Matthew remained seated alone for several minutes after others left. He stared at the skyline through glass that suddenly felt less like elevation and more like exposure. His phone vibrated. A message from Charles Dunham. "Final ruling on classification likely within weeks. Appreciation argument weak." Matthew closed his eyes briefly. Ownership had slipped beyond argument. Now leadership stood under quiet review. That evening, Thomas Reed requested a private meeting with Paige at a neutral location, an understated conference suite at a midtown law firm unaffiliated with either side. Paige arrived alone. She wore a simple navy coat and carried no visible documents. Thomas began carefully. "The board must evaluate executive continuity," he said. Paige listened without interruption. "You hold majority authority," he continued, "but abrupt leadership removal could destabilize markets." "I understand," Paige replied. Thomas watched her closely. "Do you intend to exercise your rights?" he asked. Paige considered the question. "I intend to preserve the company's stability," she said. "That may require change," Thomas replied. "Change is not the same as punishment," Paige answered. Thomas nodded slowly. In that moment, he recognized something Matthew had missed. She was not driven by reaction. She was guided by structure. Meanwhile, Matthew met with Robert in his office late into the night. "You think they'll remove me?" Matthew said bluntly. Robert chose honesty. "They're considering contingency." Matthew exhaled sharply. "I built this," he said. Robert's voice remained steady. "You let it. That's not the same as owning it." The distinction landed harder now than it ever had before. Matthew turned toward the window. "I won't be humiliated," he said quietly. Robert did not respond, because humiliation was not being discussed. Procedure was. The next morning, Paige returned to Hale Industries as usual. She moved through hallways with the same measured pace. But something subtle had shifted in how people stepped aside for her. Not deference, recognition. At noon, an internal memorandum circulated: special board session executive leadership review. Confidential. Matthew read it alone in his office. He did not react outwardly. He straightened his tie, adjusted papers on his desk, and prepared for the meeting as he would any other. Paige received a separate notification from Victoria Board initiating review. "You may be asked to formalize position." She typed a brief reply. "Understood." That evening, as Manhattan lights flickered against the river, Matthew and Paige crossed paths in the penthouse hallway. He stopped. "Are you going to remove me?" he asked. She met his gaze. "I haven't decided anything," she said. "You already have power," he replied. "Power isn't removal," she answered quietly. "It's responsibility." He searched her expression for anger. There was none. That unsettled him more than accusation would have. He nodded once and walked past her. Inside her study, Paige opened the original Porter Trust document again. Her father's signature at the bottom, her own beneath it years later. Ownership had never been about dominance. It had been about stewardship. If leadership eroded trust, structure required correction. Not revenge, correction. In the boardroom, the following week, directors would cast votes not in reaction to a divorce, but in response to governance concerns. Matthew still believed he could persuade them. Paige understood persuasion was no longer the central variable. Stability was. And stability, once questioned, demands adjustment. The era of assumption had ended. The era of accountability had begun. The special board session was scheduled for Friday at 7:00 a.m., early enough to avoid market speculation, late enough to allow preparation. Matthew arrived first. He wore the same navy suit he had worn the night of the gala, pressed, deliberate, controlled. He placed his leather portfolio at the head of the walnut table and reviewed printed notes outlining projected growth expansion contracts in negotiation revenue forecasts for the next 3 quarters. Numbers still favored him. Performance had not collapsed. But confidence is not the only metric boards measure. Thomas Reed entered next, followed by Robert Klein and the remaining directors. Corporate counsel joined via secure video link. Paige arrived at 7:05 a.m., not in uniform. For the first time since she began working inside Hale Industries, she entered the boardroom dressed not as facilities staff, but as majority shareholder. Charcoal suit, minimal jewelry, no visible expression beyond composure. Conversations paused when she took a seat along the side of the table, not at the head, not opposite Matthew. Beside him. The placement was intentional. Thomas opened the meeting. This session concerns executive leadership review under Governance Charter Section 4.3, he began. Matthew nodded slightly. Given recent disclosures and pending legal proceedings, we must evaluate whether continued leadership under current circumstances best serves corporate stability. The phrasing was measured. No accusation, no condemnation. Matthew stood. I understand the board's responsibility, he said evenly. But let's be clear, our financial performance remains strong. Revenue is up 12% year over year. Expansion contracts are secured. Market confidence stabilized after disclosure. He gestured toward projected slides on the screen. I have led this company through exponential growth. Personal matters should not disrupt operational success. Robert spoke carefully. The concern is not performance, he said. It is governance alignment. Matthew's gaze sharpened slightly. You're suggesting I cannot separate personal and professional obligations. I'm suggesting perception influences stability, Robert replied. Thomas turned toward Paige. Miss Porter, as majority shareholder, your position carries significant weight, he said. All eyes shifted to her. She did not stand. She spoke calmly from her seat. I recognize Mr. Hale's contributions, she said. They are measurable and significant. Matthew listened, uncertain. But governance requires trust, she continued. Recent actions, specifically attempted share dilution during active litigation, complicate that trust. Matthew exhaled slowly. It was strategic timing, he said. It was contested timing, she replied. Silence settled again. Thomas folded his hands. The board must consider whether interim leadership is appropriate until final court rulings conclude. Matthew absorbed the phrase. Interim leadership, temporary removal, not termination, but displacement. He looked directly at Paige. Do you believe I'm incapable of leading? He asked. She met his gaze evenly. I believe stability requires alignment between ownership and leadership, she answered. He understood then. This was not retaliation for humiliation. It was recalibration. Thomas called for executive session, excluding Matthew. He left the room without protest. In the adjacent office, he stood by the window, overlooking the river, hands clasped behind his back. He had always equated leadership with endurance. Now, endurance required waiting. Inside the boardroom, Deliberations unfolded quietly. Robert spoke first. Financials are strong, but investor confidence depends on clarity. Another director added, we cannot risk governance disputes while expansion negotiations are active. Thomas turned toward Paige. If we appoint interim leadership, markets may interpret it as instability. Paige considered the statement. Markets respond to uncertainty, she said. Certainty of process is stronger than appearance of unity. Thomas studied her carefully. Are you prepared to assume direct oversight? He asked. Yes, she replied. The room absorbed that answer. No hesitation, no flourish, just readiness. After 40 minutes of discussion, Thomas called Matthew back into the room. He entered calmly. Thomas spoke clearly. The board has voted to appoint an interim CEO pending final court resolution. This is not termination. It is procedural stabilization. Matthew's expression did not change immediately. Effective when he asked. Immediately, Thomas said. And the interim, Matthew asked. Thomas glanced briefly toward Paige. Miss Porter will assume interim executive oversight. The decision was unanimous. Matthew felt the weight of it settle. He had prepared arguments for removal framed as betrayal. This was not betrayal. It was governance. He nodded once. Understood, he said. No one applauded. No one avoided his gaze. The meeting adjourned without ceremony. News broke within the hour. Hale Industries announces interim leadership appointment. Stock dipped briefly, then stabilized. Analysts described the move as measured corporate governance. In his office, Matthew removed framed photographs from his desk. Industry Awards magazine covers the photo from the merger celebration. He did not rush. Robert entered quietly. This isn't personal, Robert said. Matthew allowed himself a faint, humorless smile. It never is, he replied. Robert hesitated before adding, You built momentum. That doesn't disappear. Matthew nodded once. But momentum without authority becomes memory. Across the hallway, Paige stood alone in the executive suite for the first time as interim CEO. The office felt unchanged. Same skyline, same polished desk. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she walked to the window. The river moved steadily below, indifferent to leadership transitions. Her phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. Board decision confirmed. Congratulations. Paige typed a brief response. Stability, not celebration. Later that afternoon, she addressed senior executives in a closed-door session. I will not alter strategic direction without review, she said calmly. Operational continuity remains priority. Transparency will increase. No dramatic declarations. No criticism of Matthew. Just clarity. Meanwhile, Matthew exited the building through the main lobby for the first time without security escort. Employees glanced toward him with uncertain expressions. Some offered respectful nods. He returned them. Outside cameras waited, but questions were restrained. Do you plan to contest the board's decision? One reporter asked. Matthew paused. No, he said. The board acted within its authority. It was the first public acknowledgement of that truth. That evening, the penthouse felt larger. Matthew stood in the living room while Paige reviewed executive briefings at the dining table. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. She looked up. I didn't, she agreed. The board did. He considered that. You supported it. I supported stability, she replied. He searched her face for anger. Still none. That unsettled him more than any accusation. Power had shifted without spectacle, without humiliation, without retaliation, only through process. And process, once initiated, does not reverse easily. The next phase would involve final settlement negotiations. But leadership had already transitioned. Ownership had asserted itself not loudly, not vindictively, but decisively. Matthew had once believed he was untouchable within the structure he commanded. Now he understood something more precise. He had been entrusted, and trust when strained recalibrates. The settlement proposal arrived 3 days after the board's decision. It was delivered not by courier, not through spectacle, but through encrypted email from Charles Dunham to Victoria Langford. Subject line: without prejudice. Settlement discussion. Matthew had reviewed it twice before authorizing its release. He had written none of it himself, but every clause carried his concession. In Victoria's Boston office, late afternoon light slanted across polished wood as she and Paige read through the document line by line. Primary terms, Victoria said evenly. Mr. Hale agrees to withdraw all claims regarding appreciation of the Porter Trust shares. He acknowledges separate property classification. Paige nodded once. Further, Victoria continued, he agrees to resign permanently as CEO and from the board of directors. In exchange, he retains personal compensation earned during marriage executive bonuses and non-controlling stock grants issued independently of the trust. No alimony request, no public dispute, a confidentiality clause, no admission of wrongdoing. Victoria looked up from the page. He's conceding control, she said quietly. Paige folded her hands. He's preserving reputation, she replied. That distinction mattered. In Manhattan, Matthew sat alone in a temporary office 2 floors below the executive suite he once occupied. He had declined public interviews. He had declined advisory roles offered by sympathetic investors. He had watched Hale Industries operate under Paige's interim oversight without disruption. Revenue projections held steady. Market analysts described the transition as remarkably contained. Contained. The word unsettled him. He had expected turbulence. Instead, the company continued, without him. Charles sat across from him. It's a pragmatic settlement, Charles said. You retain substantial personal wealth. You avoid protracted litigation. The board stabilizes. Matthew stared at the city beyond the window. She never asked for apology, he said quietly. No, Charles agreed. She never demanded anything publicly. No. Matthew leaned back. She could have, he said. Yes, Charles replied. But she had not. That absence lingered more heavily than accusation would have. Back in Boston, Victoria closed the settlement packet. Do you accept? She asked. Paige considered the question carefully. This was not a moment for victory. It was conclusion. I accept the structural terms, she said. Add one provision. Victoria waited. He will not contest governance decisions moving forward, Paige said, and he will not pursue derivative claims against the board. Victoria nodded slowly. That's reasonable. It was not punishment. It was finality. The revised draft was returned within 24 hours. Matthew reviewed the added clause. He exhaled slowly. Add my agreement, he said. Charles hesitated briefly. You're certain, yes? Signing required no ceremony. No witnesses beyond legal counsel. Matthew signed in black ink, deliberate and precise. Paige signed in Boston, her signature steady beneath his. 7 years of marriage reduced to structured paragraphs and notarized pages. The court approved the settlement swiftly. No contested hearing. No public spectacle. The divorce was finalized in under 4 months from the gala announcement. In the days following, Matthew packed the last of his personal belongings from the penthouse. He chose not to contest occupancy. The property had been purchased under his compensation package, but Paige did not challenge his claim to it. I'll relocate, she had said simply. He paused at the doorway the morning he left. Was there ever a point, he asked quietly, where you would have told me Paige stood near the window? I expected you to ask, she replied. He considered that answer. He nodded once and left without further words. At Hale Industries, the board convened for formal leadership confirmation. Paige entered the boardroom without uniform, without announcement. Thomas Reed addressed the room. Interim oversight has stabilized operations, he said. I propose confirmation of Miss Porter as permanent CEO. The vote was unanimous. There was no applause, only acknowledgement. Afterward, Thomas lingered. You handled this without spectacle, he said quietly. Paige met his gaze. Spectacle destabilizes markets, she replied. Thomas allowed himself the faintest smile. Matthew watched the announcement from a private office in Midtown he had leased temporarily. The press release was restrained. Hale Industries announces appointment of Paige Porter as Chief Executive Officer. No mention of divorce. No reference to prior leadership conflict. He read it once, then again. He did not feel anger. He felt clarity. He had mistaken position for ownership, mistaken silence for insignificance, mistaken structure for suggestion. Now the structure stood without him. That evening, Paige visited the original Newark warehouse site, now converted into a logistics innovation hub. She walked through corridors where old photographs of early operations hung framed. Her grandfather's name appeared only in small print in an archival plaque. She touched the edge of it briefly. Ownership was inheritance. Leadership was choice. She had not sought either publicly, but she accepted both. Victoria called that night. "It's done," she said. "Yes," Paige replied. "No regrets?" Victoria asked. Paige considered. "Regret belongs to assumptions," she said. This was correction. Matthew boarded a flight to Chicago 2 days later to attend an industry conference, not as keynote speaker, but as panel participant. He introduced himself without title. He listened more than he spoke. The experience was unfamiliar. Humbling, not humiliating, just different. Back in Manhattan, Paige prepared her first official address to shareholders. She wrote it herself. No speechwriters, no grand language, only structure. She did not reference Matthew. She did not reference the divorce. She referenced governance stability and long-term responsibility, because ownership without noise is still ownership, and correction without cruelty is still correction. The settlement had not ended a war. It had ended misalignment. Matthew walked away with wealth intact, but authority relinquished. Paige remained with responsibility affirmed, but ego uninflated. Justice had not arrived with raised voices. It had arrived through documentation, through restraint, through refusal to retaliate when retaliation was possible. The next chapter would not revolve around what was lost. It would revolve around what endured: structure, stewardship, and the quiet strength that never required a stage. Paige did not hold a press conference. She did not sit for magazine covers or accept invitations to speak about female leadership in crisis. Requests arrived in steady waves after her appointment was confirmed. Financial journals, business networks, even late-night television producers sensing narrative appeal. She declined them all. Hale Industries released quarterly earnings under her signature 2 weeks later. Revenue remained stable. Expansion plans were reviewed, not abandoned. Cost structures were recalibrated conservatively. Markets responded not with excitement, but with steadiness. Steadiness was enough. On her first official morning as permanent CEO, Paige arrived at headquarters before dawn. No escort, no announcement. She rode the main elevator this time, not the service lift. The doors opened to the executive floor she had once cleaned in silence. The corridor looked identical. Only perception had shifted. Her office, formerly Matthew's, had been left unchanged except for removal of personal decor. She requested no renovations, no new furniture. She sat at the desk and reviewed governance reports Thomas had left overnight. The attempted share dilution proposal remained archived. She marked it closed, not erased, closed. At 9:00 a.m., she convened her first executive committee meeting. Robert Klein sat directly across from her. There was no tension in his posture, only professional recalibration. Paige began without preamble. "Operational continuity remains priority," she said. "No expansion initiatives will proceed without board alignment and long-term risk assessment. No reference to the past, no commentary on Matthew's decisions, just forward direction." One executive asked carefully, "Will there be structural changes in senior leadership?" "Yes," Paige replied. "Performance reviews will be conducted objectively. No purge, no spectacle. Correction through process." Outside the building, journalists lingered for days, hoping for visible drama. They found none. Matthew relocated to a smaller apartment overlooking the Chicago River. He accepted a consulting role with a mid-sized logistics firm, advisory, not executive. His name still carried weight. but it no longer carried control. He adjusted gradually. At first, the absence of authority felt like amputation, then like quiet. He read articles about Hale Industries with measured distance. The tone was neutral. No scandal, no chaos, just transition. One evening, months after the settlement, Matthew sat alone in his new apartment and replayed the gala in memory. The applause, the envelope, the word charity. He understood now that humiliation had been unnecessary, and unnecessary acts reveal more about the speaker than the target. He had mistaken dominance for clarity. Meanwhile, Paige visited the penthouse for the last time. She had decided not to keep it. The view of Central Park remained expansive, but the space felt tethered to a chapter already closed. She arranged its sale through a private brokerage and redirected proceeds into the Porter Trust's philanthropic division. Quiet educational grants in industrial cities, workforce training programs in manufacturing towns like Newark. No announcement, no foundation gala, just allocation. In the months that followed, Hale Industries shifted subtly under her leadership. Internal audit processes strengthened. Whistleblower protections expanded. Equity compensation structures were adjusted to reward long-term performance over rapid expansion. Thomas Reed observed the changes with quiet approval. "She's not reactive," he told Robert during one meeting. "She's structural," Robert replied. Paige also made one symbolic change. She eliminated the executive parking tier. All senior leadership, including herself, parked in the same underground garage as mid-level managers. It was not a grand statement. It was alignment. Employees noticed, not loudly, but steadily. Matthew watched from distance as company culture evolved. He felt no bitterness, only awareness. He had driven acceleration. She implemented calibration, both necessary, but in different seasons. One afternoon, Paige received a letter forwarded from Hale Industries' Chicago office. It was handwritten, from a former warehouse supervisor who had worked under Matthew's early expansion push. The letter thanked her for reinstating safety compliance measures that had been reduced during rapid scaling. No mention of the divorce, no reference to ownership, just gratitude for correction. Paige folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. Justice is rarely theatrical. It is procedural, measured, and often invisible. Late one evening, Thomas Reed stopped by her office. "You could have removed him publicly," he said quietly. "Yes," Paige replied. "You didn't." "No." Why, she considered the question. Because the company was never the stage, she answered. Thomas nodded slowly. He understood. The building's lights dimmed as employees departed. Paige remained at her desk reviewing long-term capital allocation strategies. Outside Manhattan, traffic pulsed with indifferent energy. Power once announced demands attention. Power once quiet commands endurance. She had not reclaimed dignity by humiliating Matthew. She had preserved it by refusing to. In Chicago, Matthew received a final document from Hale Industries Board, a formal acknowledgement of his prior leadership contributions, and a statement of appreciation for a transitional cooperation. He read it carefully. It was concise, respectful. He placed it in a drawer without display. He had lost title. But he had not been erased. Months later, at a small industry symposium in Chicago, a young executive asked Matthew a pointed question. "What's the biggest lesson you've learned about leadership?" she asked. Matthew paused longer than necessary. "Ownership and authority aren't the same," he said finally. "And silence isn't absence." The room absorbed that. Back in Manhattan, Paige prepared for the annual shareholder meeting. It would be her first as confirmed CEO. She did not rehearse dramatic lines. She did not prepare to reference the past. She prepared numbers, strategy, responsibility, because departure when done with dignity leaves no debris, and leadership when accepted without noise reshapes structure quietly. The gala that once defined humiliation had faded into memory. In its place stood governance restored, alignment regained, and a woman who had never needed a microphone to hold power. The annual shareholder meeting convened in the same ballroom. where Matthew had once announced his divorce. The Latham Grand had polished its marble floors to the same reflective sheen. The chandeliers refracted light with identical brilliance. The stage had been assembled in the same place, but the arrangement felt different. No string quartet, no dramatic video montage, just a clean podium, a projection screen, and rows of shareholders seated in quiet expectation. Paige arrived through the main entrance, not the service corridor. She wore a tailored black suit, understated and precise. No visible jewelry beyond a slim watch. No security detail beyond standard corporate protocol. Thomas Reed met her near the front row. "Everything is ready," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Thank you." Investors filled the room, institutional representatives, long-term private shareholders, analysts. Some had witnessed the gala months earlier. They remembered the envelope. They remembered the word charity. Now they waited. Thomas opened the meeting with formalities, approval of minutes, financial summaries, committee reports. Then he stepped aside. "Please welcome Hale Industries Chief Executive Officer, Miss Paige Porter." There was applause, measured, respectful. Paige walked to the podium without haste. She adjusted the microphone slightly, not to lower it, not to raise it, just to center it. For a moment she surveyed the room. No lingering bitterness, no visible triumph, just assessment. "Good morning," she began. Her voice carried evenly across the ballroom. "Over the past fiscal year, Hale Industries has maintained revenue growth of 9% while reducing debt exposure by 14%. Operational efficiency improved across 3 divisions. Safety compliance metrics have been restored to pre-expansion benchmarks. Numbers first, not narrative." She continued. "Our strategic focus moving forward prioritizes sustainable expansion over accelerated acquisition. Long-term stability remains our guiding principle." She paused briefly, not for effect, but to transition. Hale Industries was built over decades through disciplined investment and operational leadership. That foundation remains intact. No mention of Matthew, no reference to the divorce, no relitigation of the gala. Just continuity. "We will not pursue growth that compromises governance," she added calmly. "Transparency, accountability, and structural alignment define our direction." Investors nodded subtly. Analysts typed notes. The room did not feel charged. It felt steady. After presenting financial projections and answering measured questions about international contracts and capital allocation, Paige closed with a brief statement. "Ownership carries responsibility," she said. "Leadership carries trust. Both must align." She did not elaborate. She stepped back from the podium. Applause followed, slightly stronger this time. Not for spectacle, for stability. After the meeting adjourned, small groups formed across the ballroom. Conversations revolved around market forecasts and strategic recalibration. No one referenced the gala openly, but memory lingered in quiet corners. Paige moved through the room without entourage. She spoke with institutional investors in concise exchanges. She answered questions without defensiveness. One shareholder approached hesitantly. "You handle the transition with restraint," he said. "Stability benefits everyone," she replied. He nodded and stepped away. Outside the hotel, late spring sunlight warmed the sidewalk. Reporters waited, but questions focused on earnings, not divorce. "Any comment on leadership changes last quarter?" one journalist asked. Paige answered evenly. "The company is aligned," she said. "That's the focus." She entered the car, waiting at the curb. No lingering for cameras. No triumphant departure. Across the country, Matthew watched a live stream replay of the meeting from his office in Chicago. He studied her delivery, measured, direct, unadorned. He noticed something he had overlooked before. She did not attempt to outperform him rhetorically. She simply anchored the room. He closed the laptop slowly. There was no resentment in the gesture, only recognition. Later that evening, Paige returned to headquarters instead of the penthouse she no longer owned. She walked alone through the executive corridor. Employees had left for the day. The building hummed softly in after-hours quiet. She entered her office and stood once more by the window overlooking the Hudson. The river moved steadily, unchanged by leadership transitions or courtroom disclosures. She thought briefly of her father's study in Boston, of his words, "Power is safest when it doesn't announce itself." She had not sought vindication. She had not sought apology. She had not corrected humiliation with humiliation. She had allowed process to unfold, allowed documentation to speak, allowed governance to recalibrate. Matthew had once believed control belonged to the one who spoke loudest in the ballroom. Now the company moved forward under someone who rarely raised her voice at all. Her phone vibrated. A message from Victoria. "Clean execution today." Paige replied, "Alignment restored." She placed the phone down. There would be more challenges ahead: market fluctuations, operational risks, strategic decisions requiring difficult balance. But the foundation was steady, not because she reclaimed power, because it had always been hers to steward. Months later, a framed plaque appeared quietly in the executive corridor. It listed the historical timeline of Hale Industries, founding year, early investment, major milestones. For the first time beneath a 32-year-old capital injection entry, the Porter name appeared clearly in print. No spotlight, no ceremony, just acknowledgement. Employees passed the plaque daily. Some noticed, some did not. Matthew visited New York once for an industry conference and walked past Hale Industries' headquarters without entering. He paused briefly across the street. The glass facade reflected the city back at him. He did not feel excluded. He felt instructed. Silence had not been weakness. It had been strength held in reserve. And ownership, when exercised with restraint, leaves no spectacle behind. Only continuity. Inside, Paige reviewed long-term investment strategies with Robert Klein. There was no trace of tension in the room, just governance, just structure, just forward movement. The gala that once echoed with applause and humiliation had become a footnote. What remained was the company, the responsibility, the quiet woman who had never needed a microphone to hold it all. In the end, justice did not arrive with raised voices or public revenge. It moved through paperwork, through signatures, through clauses written decades earlier by people who understood that strength does not require display. Paige never answered humiliation with humiliation. She answered it with documentation, with patience, with alignment. Matthew was not destroyed. He was corrected by structure he had never fully examined. And correction, when accepted, becomes lesson rather than ruin. Some stories end with applause. This one ends with steadiness. If this story resonated with you, if you believe dignity should never require volume, take a moment to reflect on where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Justice looks different in every place, but its quiet form is universal. And if you value stories about strength that doesn't shout, you're welcome to stay. There are more waiting to be told.